A major step forward in a 16-year legal battle. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has approved a revised agreement to compensate victims of Canada's underfunded First Nations child welfare system. The deal will see the government pay $23.4 billion. That money will go to an estimated 300,000 children, youth, and families who were discriminated against by the system. Cindy Blackstock is Executive Director at the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. Cindy, thanks for doing this. This is being described as the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, though it still must be approved by the federal court. What would this mean for the First Nations children and families involved?
Brett, it's one step towards justice. I mean, the harms to these families were unbelievable. Canada's choosing to underfund these public services led to thousands of children being separated from their families when with supports they could have grown up together, and other children experienced harm, and even Canada's discrimination contributed to the deaths of some children. So it's an acknowledgement that those harms happened. But to really get justice, we need to stop the discrimination and make sure it never happens again. Okay, I want to pick up on that point a little bit later, but right now I want to ask you about the way the Human Rights Tribunal rejected a previous version of the proposed settlement. It didn't satisfy a pre-existing compensation order from 2019. What's different about the new revised version? Right, in that previous version, things like some of the children in care would have seen their $40,000 awarded by the tribunal go down to nothing. And in other cases, we would have seen the estates of children and families disentitled. And more families would have been in a kind of an unsure place of whether they would have received the $40,000 or gotten less or gotten nothing. So for those reasons, the Caring Society opposed it along with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and the tribunal agreed with us. In this new revised settlement agreement, everybody is in, just as the Chiefs and Assembly directed us to do.
And how confident are you that the deal will succeed at federal court as well now that it has to go there for final approval?
Well, I'm feeling pretty confident. I mean, the tribunal knows this case the best. I think they've been at it for 12 years and they gave it a good, solid review. So I'm feeling fairly confident that when it hits the federal court, likely in October, that the federal court will agree.
And I want to take a step back a little bit. You've been pressing this human rights complaint for 16 years. You've been fighting against the Liberal and previously the Conservative federal government. You've seen Assembly of First Nations, national chiefs come and go as the AFN has backed you on this complaint. What sort of toll has this long, drawn-out battle taken on you?
Well, I mean, it's been more of a privilege than it has been a toll. I mean, I definitely have aged 16 years. But during that time, I think the hardest thing was seeing the children continue to suffer needlessly, Brett. Like, there were solutions on the books to address this discrimination, and Canada chose not to do it. They didn't fail. That's a different thing. They actually chose to allow these kids to be heard, and that was really, really difficult to go through. So I'm so happy now to kind of see at least that harm recognized. But as I say, you know, all these victims, they often say to me, look, we told our truth so that no one else would have to go through it. And that's the big ticket item, is we have to do that work to make sure no one does go through it.
Well, you certainly have come a long way. I remember when the federal government was ordered to compensate you for retaliating against you for filing this complaint. So it certainly has been a journey. Do you feel like the end of the road is in sight on this?
I'm not sure. It'll depend on the government. I mean, we need to make sure that we keep the pressure up, because we don't want them to get away with just compensating the past victims while creating new victims. We actually want to see, for the first time in history, First Nations kids not being hurt by Canada anymore. So I want to make sure that actually happens. And I have seen from the government a lot less talk about reconciliation lately, and that really worries me. So I'm really hoping that Canadians really push their members of parliament to say, finish the job, make sure that kids aren't hurt anymore, and let's make sure that this is a first generation of First Nations kids that don't have to recover from their childhoods.
Well, you mentioned this point earlier, and I said I wanted to return to it. The tribunal also indicated in its letter decision that the discriminatory funding and delivery of child and family services to First Nations communities has to stop. How close is the federal government to making that happen?
Well, we're well on our way to working with First Nations colleagues and First Nations leadership across the country to come up with evidence-informed solutions with created by the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, Brett. That's a group headed by the former Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page. So we've got the solutions. The key is going to be, will the government actually implement them properly? Because we've seen time and time again where there's been recommendations to fix the problem, and then the government interprets it in such a narrow way that it doesn't have the effect it should have, or they don't do it altogether. So it really is in the government's ballpark. Are they serious about making sure that this generation of kids doesn't get hurt again? Or are we going to be back at it in another 20 years? I sure hope not, because these kids deserve better.
And what needs to change in the government's approach to guarantee that this doesn't happen again and you're not back at it in the next few years?
They need to implement the solutions that have been researched and created by First Nations communities. They need to fully fund in a meaningful way anybody who draws down jurisdiction, and allow people to draw down jurisdiction through inherent right and other things, not just their Bill C-92. And we also need to see them fully implement Jordan's principle. The final thing we need to do is reform the department itself so that when it hears that it's discriminating against kids, that it looks at the critique, it evaluates it, it stops doing the bad behavior, and it learns from it. Canada's a repeat offender when it comes to First Nations kids, Brett. Residential schools, the 60 Scoop, now this case, and they haven't learned. So we need to make sure they learn so they don't do it again. Okay, and on one final note, assuming all does go well for you at the federal court, what's next for Cindy Blackstock? Well, I got to finish that work that the kids asked me to do, which is make sure no one ever goes through it again. And then, I think that there's other inequalities that we need to look to in education and water and all these things. I want a generation of First Nations kids that doesn't have to dream about a clean glass of water. I want them to dream about becoming the best dancer or astronaut or engineer or doctor or whatever they want to do. The same kind of dreams other kids do, not to dream to have basic human rights recognized.
All right, we have to leave it there. Cindy, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thanks a lot, Brad. Really appreciate it.